Okay, this is our last installment of the last several pages of the chapter January. Don't forget to open up to your January notes. And you should have left notes yesterday about not Danny, Hauling, and how he was feeling during the New York State assessment and the conflict that was building between Halling and Doug Switek's brother. So you will be at the top of page 121, and that begins with, he walked over to me, stuck his finger out, and poked it into my thermal underwear chest. Did you throw that snowball at me? When? I said. This is called a delaying tactic and is sometimes more strategic than denial all by itself. You, he poked his finger into me, are, he poked again, dead. He poked again. Then he wiped his wet finger off on his shirt. This is getting familiar, isn't it? Another death threat. I could sort of understand how it must have been for Banquo, and for a moment in my heated, sweaty brain, I could almost see him there in the boys' restroom, covered with stab wounds, looking sort of lost and shaking his head like he wanted to warn me. Dead, said Doug Switek's brother again. I backed out. Doug Switek's brother's little rat eyes followed me all the way. I went back to Mrs. Baker's classroom and sat down squishily. Toads, beetles, bats. Are you feeling better? Asked Merrill Lee. Just swell, I said. Outside it was still snowing, but the temperature had come up, and the flakes that were coming down were the kind that really wanted to be rain but couldn't quite get there. When they hit the snow that had already fallen, they froze into a thin crust and coated everything in sight. Mrs. Baker was looking out the window and frowning, and I knew she was wondering how the school buses would ever drive on roads with a frozen crust and snow beneath that and ice beneath that. She was probably also wondering how she would drive home herself on roads with frozen crust and snow beneath that and ice beneath that. In every other class at Camillo Junior High, the last half hour after a day of the New York State Standardized Achievement Tests was free reading time or snacks or story hour or something. A lot of teachers brought in brown light perfect cream puffs for their classes. But Mrs. Baker, the holiday-hating Mrs. Baker, had us open English for you and me and start on a new unit, strong verb systems. It was hard to concentrate, fresh from Doug Switek's brother's rat eyes and sitting in squishy thermal underwear, but Mrs. Baker never called on me, not even when I raised my hand, not even when I hollered out that I could tell her why to write was a strong verb. And so the clock clicked down to the end of the school day. I headed outside watching for Doug Switek's brother, his words hovering like the snow in the air. You are dead. Nowhere in the halls. I left through the main lobby doors, under a picture of Ariel that Mr. Vendelari hadn't reached. Looking up at it, I felt again the thrill of the Vengeur, but I kept looking for the Vengee, still nowhere in sight. And now the cold air struck me, and I held my coat open to it, and down below my 2 t-shirts, my thermal underwear suddenly chilled, and I felt the temperature of my body drop and my face cool. Are you all right? Asked Danny Hupfer. Just swell, I said, and I really meant it. I crossed the schoolyard. Doug Switek's brother must have already gone, and came out onto Lee Avenue, where the school buses were spinning their wheels on the ice while Mr. Goreshi stood by the fence with his arms crossed, I suppose to prevent the state penitentiary crowd from riding the bumpers. But none of them were in sight either, which I'm sure that Mr. Goreshi was glad for, since on the other side of the street a Hometown Chronicle photographer was taking pictures of the buses turning onto the ice, finding a little traction for a moment, and then losing it, and sliding sideways, flinging down snow from their yellow roofs. By the time I got to the corner opposite Camillo Junior High, one of the buses was gunning its engine frantically, trying to get some momentum, and at the same time, trying to ease around Mrs. Baker's very, very slowly moving car. And that is what made the rest of what happened happen. It took only about 3 seconds, and I didn't see much of it since the wet flakes were coming down hard again. But here's what happened as near as I can tell. When I got to the corner, Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd were waiting for me on the other side. They stood in line like a platoon, and each one lifted up his left arm, and pointed at me. In their right hands, they held snowballs as big as bowling balls. The street lights were already on in the gray darkness, and their light glittered yellow off the snowballs' icy coating. At least, I hope that's why the snowballs looked yellow. I needed about a second to take that in, I guess. In the next second, the school bus gunned its ancient engine and then started to slide across the intersection. Slide sideways, that is, and through the red light. I watched as the bus's back end went by me, moving in a couple of different directions. I could see Danny's face out the back window. He was looking kind of startled, but happy. The next day, he told me that he'd never heard a school bus driver scream that way before, which I can vouch for. I heard her too. And that leaves the third second when I started to turn back from the bus to see what Doug Switek's brother and the penitentiary crowd were going to do when the bus slid across the intersection and onto their corner. But I never got to them. Because walking across Lee Avenue in the middle of the road, her head down and her scarf pulled over her ears because she didn't want the wet snow to dampen her Southern California hair, was my sister. Walking back home an hour late because of the New York State Standardized Achievement Tests. I took off. I remember hearing the air brakes and someone yelling, "Mr. Hood!" and "Oh!" That came from my sister when I hit her just ahead of the sliding school bus. I remember seeing her rolling out of the way and into the snowbank by the curb, which I saw from a sort of aerial view because the right rear bumper of the bus caught me where I had worn my white feathers. And so I was crossing the rest of Lee Avenue intersection at a height of about 5 feet. I landed in the snowbank by Goldman's Best Bakery. When I opened my eyes, my sister was looking down at me. Mr. Goldman was looking down at me. Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd were looking down at me. The bus driver was looking down at me. Danny was looking down at me. Mr. Goreshi was looking down at me. And Mrs. Baker was holding my head in her hands. "Holling," she said, "are you hurt?" "Not the part you're holding," I said. My sister was crying. "Really?" "Holling," she said, "you saved my life." "High drama does not help us right now," said Mrs. Baker. "Hold his head out of the snow and I'll get my car." I shifted myself around. I was starting to get cold since the sweat on the little cotton compartments of my thermal underwear was turning to ice. "I think I'm all right," I said. "You'll have to go to the emergency room," said Mr. Goreshi. "Mrs. Baker is going to drive us. Can you move your toes?" Of course I couldn't move my toes. I still had on my thick socks. "No, but I think I'm really all right." Mrs. Baker pulled up in her car. "Help him in," she said to Doug Switek's brother. "And you help too," she said to the state penitentiary crowd. They gathered around me. "Mrs. Baker," I said. "Be quiet," she said, and Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd lifted me up out of the snowbank and hefted me across the icy crust and handed me into Mrs. Baker's back seat. Mr. Goreshi got in beside me and held my head still, though that wasn't the part of me that was hurting. My sister got in the front seat, and we careened down Lee Avenue, stopping only to let my sister off at our house so that she could tell my mother where we were going. Mrs. Baker held her hand down on the horn at every intersection, fishtailed through most of her turns, and pretty much hit the entrance to the emergency room in one long sideways slide. When we got inside, I was limping a little, but Mr. Goreshi held on to my right arm the whole way. Mrs. Baker couldn't find the words she needed to describe the location of the injury. Shakespeare doesn't give you everything. She finally settled on his buttocks, which the nurse understood. "Are you his father?" the nurse asked Mr. Goreshi. "His principal." "Then you must be his mother," said the nurse. "I am his teacher," said Mrs. Baker. "Perhaps a diagnostic hip x-ray would be in order." "I'll inform the doctor of your intended procedure," said the nurse, which was a nurse joke, which is worse than a teacher joke. "I'll need to speak to one of the boys' parents before we do anything." Mr. Goreshi helped me back to the waiting room, and Mrs. Baker made me lie down on 3 of the chairs. "Stay on your side and be still," while she called my father. Mr. Goreshi took off my boots so that I could move my toes and then found a blanket who knows where to stretch over me. When Mrs. Baker came back, her face was set and hard. Your father has spoken over the phone with the nurse at the front desk. He has given approval for any necessary procedure and says that, since everything seems under control, he'll be along as soon as may be convenient. She adjusted the blanket and sat down next to Mr. Goreshi. We waited and waited and waited, since apparently being hit on the buttocks isn't that big a deal in this emergency room. Outside, it grew dark and still we waited. A nurse came in to turn on a portable television in the corner, and after a few horizontal blips, there was Robert Kennedy confirming that he was considering a run against President Johnson because of the government's war policy, and then Walter Cronkite looking about as serious as a human being can look, and reporting the news from Vietnam. There were pictures of soldiers cutting through a jungle path. There were pictures of soldiers capturing a Viet Cong POW. There were pictures of soldiers standing around supply caches. It was warm in the waiting room and close, and the blanket was heavy, and my thermal underwear had thawed and was starting to heat up again. I yawned. I think I could fall asleep, I said to Mrs. Baker, but she didn't answer. When I turned to see why, and this wasn't easy, since I was still lying down and wasn't supposed to move my buttocks, she was standing with her hands up to her face, watching the pictures from Vietnam like she was watching for someone she knew. Actually, like she was watching for someone she was worrying about, someone she loved. Mr. Goreshi and I left her alone. The nurse came for me soon afterward, and my buttocks were x-rayed, and let me tell you, it's embarrassing to hold your buttocks the way I had to hold my buttocks, so that they could be x-rayed. Then we waited again until the doctor came out and told us everything was fine, that I would be sore for a week or so and have a bruise that would turn purple and green, but it didn't matter since it was where it was. Then Mrs. Baker signed some papers while Mr. Goreshi put my boots back on and helped me outside to the car and settled me in the back seat. He took the blanket with us so I would be warm. When Mrs. Baker came, he got in the front seat with her, and Mrs. Baker drove me to the perfect house. Together they walked me to the door. Thank you so much for bringing him home on such a terrible night to drive, said my mother, and I limped out to the kitchen to eat supper standing. On the counter was the late edition of the Hometown Chronicle, and on the front page there was an action shot of me hauling Hood, flying in the air across the intersection of Lee Avenue and Main Street, my legs splayed out as though I really was flying, which I guess I was. Underneath the headline, which was this: Local hero hauling Hood soars across intersection to rescue sister. You could see her in the picture too, but mostly just her buttocks. The doctor was right about being sore. I'm not sure about the bruise since it hurt to stretch around that far to see, but it didn't matter all that much because when I got to school on Monday, someone had gone up and down the halls of Camellia Junior High, taping up pictures of local hero hauling Hood soaring across the intersection. They were on the 8th grade lockers, on the asbestos tiles on the ceiling, on the stalls of the boys' restroom and the girls' restroom too, over the drinking fountains, on the classroom doors, on the fire escape doors, on the walls of the stairwells, over the doors of the main lobby, and on the backboards of the basketball hoops in the gym. Can you imagine what it's like to walk down the halls of your junior high and just about every single person you meet looks at you and starts to grin, and it's because they're glad to see you? It's sort of like Macduff walking in with Macbeth's head in his hand and showing it to Malcolm, who, as we all know, is one of the king's sons. And everyone starts to celebrate because Malcolm will finally be king, but all that Malcolm is thinking is that now he has no more need for vengeance. Let me tell you, it was a great day back. And Tom Seaver had a pretty good day too. The Mets announced that they were going to pay him $24,000 next season, just like Ed Kranepool. Can you believe it? Okay, that's the end of the January chapter. So add some notes about the turn of events with Halling as he left school with his eyes out for Doug Switek's brother, and how things turned around overall by the end of the chapter from where it was in the beginning. And possibly add to your notes your thoughts on Who was there for Holling when he went through his ordeal with the bus and the hospital, and who wasn't there?